I think that with all the turbulent changes and all the chaos happening in the world, if you boil it down, and increasingly you can boil it down to a plot line that's remarkably simple, which is that the American century is coming to an end. In many ways, the American century is over. And the US has been suffering this protracted decline in terms of its imperialist weight on the global arena. But now that decline is accelerating with a breathtaking speed. And it's been accompanied by the steady rise of primarily two new superpowers, China and Russia. That's basically the process that's unfolding right now. And we're watching it happen in real time. For the Western imperialists, the worst part of this story, beginning with the American ruling class, which is increasingly entering a period of panic, is that those superpowers are not only more closely aligned than ever before, those rival powers, they're consciously and energetically building a bloc against the declining West. The trade bloc, to begin with, in the form of BRICS and BRICS Plus, now has 11 member countries. There's 12 more countries that are seeking to join BRICS or are applying for partner country status. They're developing infrastructure financing through the BRICS Bank. They're talking about trade in local currencies instead of using the dollar. There's still plans for developing a BRICS currency. There's electronic payment initiatives. Brazil is heading this up. So there's all of these developments in place, but it's not just a trade bloc. Last weekend in Tianjin, more than 20 heads of state attended this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. That was formed in 2001. And initially it was Russia, China, and a handful of Central Asian countries. It's since been joined by more than a dozen more countries. But you saw also this military parade in Beijing, which the world is talking about. I mean, this was a display of the largest army in the world. They unveiled 76 different weapons. 47 of them were brand new weapons, very advanced ones too. All kinds of the nuclear arsenal, hypersonic missiles, robot wolves that come out of Black Mirror. And if you compare this to Trump's birthday parade, it makes you think that like the night before the big parade, the US Army General Staff was probably telling the soldiers, the main thing out there tomorrow is have fun. It's your birthday. We're out there to have a good time. No matter what happens, put a smile on. And I think that's the way that the US Army was marching. The impression that the Chinese military has given the world is a very different one. But the big headline from the SCO last weekend was this unprecedented unity, not just between China and Russia, which the West used to think was impossible. China, Russia, and India. That's the big headline. They're calling it the Troika, Xi, Putin, and Modi. And just a few words about the significance of India joining this. India was part of BRICS, but it was kind of a half in, half out. India had a policy which they called strategic autonomy. Basically means we're going to try and we're not going to pick sides. We're not going to go all in for one or the other. They were keeping their options open. There was also a long-standing assumption that China and India cannot get along. There's been problems between China and India since they had a war in 1962. There was a border dispute between India and China in a region in the Himalayas. And China gained control of a section of India that was roughly the size of Switzerland. It still controls it to this day. And that continues to be a disputed border. Along that border, there was military hostilities just 5 years ago. There was something like a couple dozen troops killed in 2020. And there's been huge military buildups on both sides of that border and economic and trade sanctions between those countries. So the US, looks at this and says, yeah, India's on our side because of this, because India is not going to get along with China. Most of the Indian ruling class has looked at, the US as the more favorable trading partner. And up until the last month, India was, in this balancing role, like the needle was turning towards India and the US getting along. At the beginning of the year, Modi visited Trump in the White House. There have been all kinds of plans and negotiations and talks taking place. After Liberation Day, J.D. Vance made a special trip to India, talking about trying to strike a deal. In July, Trump said we're very close to a deal with India. And the war between India and Pakistan also made it seem like things were going in the direction of the US as well. After all, China has a strategic partnership with Pakistan, was helping to arm Pakistan in that conflict. It seemed there's no way that India and China are going to get along. Last month, all of this was blown up by Trump. All of this has fallen apart. When the Trump administration decided to put a 50% tariff on India, they doubled the rate from 25 to 50%. India and Brazil are now at the top of the list. China's still being decided. But why did Trump do this? I mean, I think that this was a miscalculation and a massive blunder. There are some people that explain this as a 5D chess move, and there's all kinds of people that have different theories about it. But the Trump team decided to go from nice diplomacy with India to playing hardball for two reasons. One is that India was refusing to cave to all of Trump's demands in the negotiations. India has tariffs on the U.S. They were unwilling to drop them down to zero, like a lot of other countries were. So there's that policy. But the main one is that they decided to use this as a way to punish India for purchasing Russian energy. Now, I found this graphic that helps you see, for those who can see it. At the top, this is the biggest wartime buyers of Russian fossil fuels since the war began. The top line is China. The second line is India. After that, you can see it drops off quite quickly. There's Turkey, EU, that's just a couple countries that aren't towing the line, like Hungary and Slovakia, Brazil, Singapore. But as you can see, China and India are the two that matter. If India stopped buying Russian oil, it really would hurt the Russian economy. And the US figured that this is the chance to split BRICS, basically at the heart of it, and to force India to pick a side. India bought $53 billion worth of Russian oil last year alone. They've been refining it and sending it to Europe. This is the way that Europe gets Russian energy, but it passes through Indian refinement as a middle ground. You know, what happened was it had the opposite of the intended effect. Russia and China are ramping up trade with India. And the symbolism of the Troika shows that Trump has actually pushed them all into the same corner. And increasingly, I mean, the remarkable thing is the degree to which Modi and Xi are putting aside their differences and saying, we're going to get along now. There's huge investments planned from Russia and China in India's economy. I mean, the three are really, it's becoming, here's how The Guardian talked about it. They stood together like old friends, heads thrown back in jovial laughter, clutching one another's hands affectionately. Except this was no ordinary gathering of three men, but a meeting of three of the most powerful non-Western leaders, Putin, Xi Jinping, and Modi. This was Modi's first visit to China in 7 years, and the hostilities that had come to define the country's relationship in recent years were nowhere to be seen. Meanwhile, China has observed the alienation of New Delhi and Washington with overt glee and has made it clear its priority now is a complete normalization of Indo-Chinese ties. Xi says it's vital to be friends, a good neighbor, the dragon, the elephant coming together, and they're going to stabilize their border. They're going to reopen their economies to each other. This means India is going to get access to Chinese rare earths, Chinese raw materials, which are going to be important. China is going to get access to a massive, massive consumer market, which China is in desperate need of, somewhere to move its commodities. Modi has shown other sides of going in for all in for BRICS as well. There's recently been meetings between Modi and Lula to discuss this, the digital payment plan. And Brazil's in a similar situation with this 50% tariff on Brazil. It was meant to hurt, you know, one of these players that was kind of in the in-between. It's totally tipped in the direction of Russia and China. 20 years ago, a quarter of Brazil's exports went to the U.S. It was a big part of their economy. Now it's down to 1/7, and that share is going to continue to plummet. This big mega port in Chancay, one of the biggest in the world in Peru, the port of Chancay, allows Chinese shipping to reach Brazil 10 days faster than it used to by going through the Panama Canal. Remember, if you look at the map, Brazil's over here. It had to go through the Panama Canal. And going to Peru, basically, is a huge shortcut. And it's basically a big move to increase trade between China and Brazil. There's been all kinds of energy deals. Russia really wants China to continue to buy even more of its gas and its oil. And now the latest deal is they're talking about a second pipeline, a second gas pipeline, Siberian Pipeline 2, from China to Russia, which China has for a long time held off on. The Chinese have wanted to be, didn't want to rely too much on Russian energy. They wanted to keep some of their options open. This is Bloomberg's article last week. Russian energy partners are moving a bit closer. China has resisted Russia's overtures for years. Why? Because the economy is not growing at the pace that it was in the early 2000s. Beijing is wary of overdependence on one supplier. Still, Trump may have changed that calculation. Under pressure, a vital energy triangle may be getting a little tighter, and that calculation has changed. I mean, every step that Trump has made has brought the trade and the diplomatic and military links, infrastructure deals, all of this a lot closer. And it's not just a small club of countries, the way Trump denigrated a couple months ago. He's talking about these little group of countries, the BRICS. By GDP, the top economies in the world are the U.S., China, Germany, and India is in fourth place. India is now the fastest major growing economy. The rate of growth in India has overtaken the Chinese rate of growth since the pandemic. It's been at over 6% annual GDP growth for the last 3 decades. And since 2021, it's been over 8%. Now, I don't know, reading about this, it made me realize that there's a lot that I don't know about the Indian economy. I'd like to learn some more about it. But one of the things I read is that there's this online service sector has had a huge part of its growth. Analysts have described it as having a unique path that's kind of skipped industrialization. It's gone from an agricultural country to like an advanced service-based country. That doesn't mean that everything is fine in the Indian economy. But if China was the workshop of the world in terms of manufacturing in the early 2000s, India has kind of found its own niche as the call center, the service support of the world. And the IMF said a quarter of its workers are in highly AI-exposed jobs, meaning that in the coming years, the developments with automation and AI could have really devastating effects on millions of workers in India. But in any case, we're talking about major economies, the fourth, at least if you measure it by GDP. Brazil and Russia are in 10th and 11th place by that measure, ahead of Spain and South Korea. But if you look at it by purchasing power parity, right, not just the dollar value, but the amount of things being produced and what's being bought, it's a different picture. Number one is China. China is now 33% larger than the United States. It's like 40 trillion by purchasing power. The US is next with around 30 trillion. India is in third place, and Russia is in fourth place, ahead of Germany, ahead of Japan. Brazil is in 8th place, ahead of France and the UK. And if you combine the economies of China, India, and Russia by purchasing power, that's 65.5 trillion. That's more than double the US economy. Combining the BRICS economies is around half of the world economy. If you look at just those 3 countries, China, India, and Russia, that's 3 billion people. That's like 38% of the global population. The US has at the present 4.2%. As JP pointed out in the Colossus book, you look at the banking assets. The top banks are now Chinese. The 4 top banks in the world are Chinese. The 5th is Japanese. In the mid-2000s, they were European. And the total combined holdings of Chinese banks, 58.5 trillion, more than double American banks. So even in these areas about the power of finance, there are some measures by which the US doesn't dominate obviously in the way that it used to. Now we're familiar with a lot of these statistics that show the various fields where China's pulled ahead of the US. But I think we should keep in mind when we're looking at this, like this new global balance of forces, that again, there's a simple story that we're telling with these figures. And it has to do with, the development of the productive forces, actually. On a global scale, capitalism has exhausted its potential to move humanity forward. But that doesn't mean that you can't have pockets of development or that stagnation isn't one homogeneous picture. You can still have areas where there's unevenness. And primarily what we see is stagnation in the part of the world, in the West, the part of the world that used to dominate global capitalism. Another thing to point out is that growth rates and annual growth in GDP doesn't mean that revolution or class struggle are ruled out by any measure. Indonesia has had a 5% annual GDP growth rate for a decade, far higher than anything in the West, and yet poverty has also grown since 2018 by 38%. The fact that you have the most of these symptoms of stagnation and the decline happening in the Western world, starting with the US, but also, the US is kind of the linchpin of what was the Western world, has huge implications for the radicalization that is our layer, that's producing our layer, this millions of people that are drawing conclusions. But Another way to kind of look at this sort of Western world, which feels like kind of a vague or fuzzy term, is the OECD countries, right? These are the countries that are generally, there's 38 of them. They're regarded as like the high income countries, the really developed countries. The OECD was a successor to the countries that received Marshall aid in Europe. Originally, it was in 1948, it was the Organization for European Economic Cooperation. And then since then, it's expanded to include basically any other high-income country that's developed along with the rules of US imperialism. So it became the OECD in 1961 as countries that were committed to democracy and to market economies. But I was looking at the growth rates. This is the GDP growth, annual growth for the OECD members. Now you can see there was two catastrophic dips here. The second one kind of distorted the line because there was a big upswing post-pandemic. But the direction of the line, I hope, is pretty clear, that it's one where the growth rates in the 1960s were above 5%. Throughout the 60s, the average growth rate was 5.3% for the OECD countries. In the 70s, 3.6%. In the 80s, it dipped below 3%. It was 2.97%. In the 90s, 2.6%. I mean, continually, the average was following. And since the 2000, the last 25 years, it's been 1.8% average growth rate. The last 5 years, 1.7. I mean, it's really quite a linear decline in terms of the economy. Now, there is something else behind this. It's not just like the rate of growth. What gave capitalism its justification was the development of the productive forces, right? The exploiters are extracting surplus value from the working class, but they're taking a portion of it and plowing it back into production. That's what justified capitalism. That's what creates the improvement in machinery, productivity, efficiency, the global market, the global division of labor. Today, you can track this with gross capital formation. This sounds like kind of a technical term, but here's exactly what gross fixed capital formation means. It measures the total value of investments in fixed assets, machinery, buildings, and equipment that are used in the production of goods and services for more than 1 year. It indicates how much new value is being invested in the economy's future productive capacity. So it's actually a pretty accurate measure of precisely what we're talking about. Are the countries investing in the means of production? Well, here's the gross fixed capital formation of the OECD countries. This is since 1970. The last one was as well. But as you can see, a very clear downward trend. The share of the economy that's being invested back into developing, investment in production, creating jobs, creating more efficiency, has been in a steady decline for more than 50 years. Here's gross fixed capital formation in China. You can see it's almost a mirror opposite. I mean, it's a remarkable uptick. And for the last period, for the last 15 years, it's averaged 42% of their GDP. Think of that. More than 4 out of $10 that the economy, 4 out of 10 RMB that the economy is generating is being plowed back into a massive investment in production, in developing high technology, research, technique, building new plants, and so on. This is the gross fixed capital formation of China versus the OECD. You see this little pathetic line down here and this mountain up here. And for the US, it's basically the same shape. This is the US gross capital formation in China. So this is the basic, I'm pointing out all these technical charts and processes because I think this is the basic story that we should keep in mind when we're talking about the balance of forces, the balance of power in the US. These are really broad strokes, but the basic thing is that for the vast majority of the capitalist world, these are the symptoms of capitalism's exhaustion. It's not developing the productive forces. And then you have these pockets where you have massive investment taking place, and we'll talk about the reasons for that. But this also means that the US is facing a rivalry that it's never, on a scale that it has never faced before. You think about the rivalry that characterized the last century between the US and the Soviet Union. By purchasing power parity, at its peak, the Soviet Union reached 60% of the size of the US economy. That's the highest it ever got. And with that was the existential rivalry that gripped the US ruling class and the Red Scare and their mortal threat. And I mean, this was the whole fear behind the Cold War was there's this power that could challenge us. That was because they had reached a point of 60%. The Chinese economy has grown to 130% of what the US is. It's already been surpassed. In the last 5 years, China produced 12 times as much steel, 3 times as many cars as the US, twice as much electricity. This has never happened. The US has never been surpassed like this industrially or economically before. And that's why this is such a historic turning point. And for the ruling class, it really is an existential, I mean, the degree of panic and the implications that are now kind of sinking in for the West are an existential threat. And they have, at this moment when they're under this huge shakeup for the world order, who's in the control room? They have a crisis of leadership, that it's Donald Trump who's manning the ship, and he's the one who's going to decide that we're going to take the world on a very different, he's not only manning the ship, but he comes in on day one, he's like, whoo, start turning onto a very different course, and everything is at the mercy of Donald Trump's decisions on how he's going to blow up the 80-year post-war liberal world order. I was thinking recently about what would it be like if Biden was still in power, or if we had Kamala in the White House dealing with all these things. And part of me was like, well, we will never know how they would. But in a way, we do know, because a year ago they were doing it. I mean, a year ago, it's not like you had a massive shift in the reality a year ago. It's just that it's finally being acknowledged. Trump was the one that stepped forward and said, this is the new reality, and we got to respond to it. The old ruling class was in complete denial. I mean, the dominant wing, the liberal wing of the ruling class, which is why they launched this war with Ukraine, with Russia, for example, why they took this opportunity to try and weaken one of their rivals. The Democrats are at an all-time low, in their polling. The Wall Street Journal published a few weeks ago a poll finding that it was at a 35-year low, basically since their polling record, they started tracking it. But it's not because of just the party got too woke. And it's not just because of how uncharismatic Kamala and Biden were, or how badly they campaigned or anything like this. We have to understand that the fate that the Democratic Party has suffered is part of a global phenomenon that's throughout the West. All of these OECD countries, where you have this picture of Western decline, are all having the same. This picture of decline is like also a picture of decline for the status quo, for the ruling institutions, for all the parties that governed in a very stable way. Think about how many of these countries had two-party systems. I started just looking just off the top of my head from a few of the UK, it was Tories and Labour for a long time. Your turn, then my turn, then your turn, kick them out, then the others come in. In Spain, it was the PSOE and the PP on the right. In Germany, the SPD and the CDU. In France, it was the Republicans and the Socialist Party. All of these, one after another, they all had a very stable arrangement, and they all entered into crisis roughly around the same time. When Trump and Sanders emerged on the scene in 2016, roughly that was the period where you had a disruption of all these two-party stable arrangements everywhere. I would say in the US, you had the same thing. It just didn't lead to the creation at this point of a new party, except if you want to, in a sense, the Republican Party pre-Trump and the Republican Party, it did kind of lead to the creation of a new party within the form of the old, and the Democrats are in a total existential crisis of their own. So you've had this disruption everywhere. The common feature of all of these countries is that, there's this generalized hatred towards all the parties that ruled for a long time, and the only force that's capitalizing it is on the right. It's the right-wing populists. There was an article on Marxist.com recently about Japan having its own version of this, the Sansei-to is a right-wing populist party. Their slogan is, there's no party worth voting for, so we're going to build one from scratch. Not a bad slogan. And they had just 2.8 thousand members in 2020. Now they just got 9 million votes in the upper house in Japan. One of their other slogans is Japan First. They're capitalizing on discontent, on anger against immigrants in Japan. And their base is basically youth and young men. I mean, this is a very similar situation all throughout, and this is one of the OECD countries. This means that the establishment is on the defensive all throughout the West. And it's just like with the Democrats, and Trump calls them the deep state, but the average human material that filled the federal bureaucracy was on this side, was born of this kind of outlook. You can call them the neocons. When Trump came around, they looked at him like a threatening foreign object that was out of his element, that didn't belong, and they tried everything to do to paralyze him and to stop him. I mean, this Russiagate thing. If anyone listens to the Daily, there's some episodes of the Daily of the New York Times podcast that are just insufferable. But this Russiagate one was like they were treating. I mean, I can't even find the words to. They were treating it like Trump is just coming up with this baseless hoax that the Russian collusion in the 2016 election wasn't real, and now Trump's using this. He's weaponizing this to go against Obama officials. It was not real. What did Russia do in 2016? Having chatbots, as J.D. Vance said at the Munich Security Conference, having some chatbots and social media posts, if that's what brings down your election, what does that tell you about the strength of your democracy? That's what Russia did in 2016, like chatbots and comments on social media. Is that what made the Democrats so unpopular? Is that what tanked Hillary Clinton's chances in 2016? And yet, the CIA, FBI officials all came together and said, yes, we found very concerning evidence that Russia has helped Donald Trump to win this election. I mean, this whole thing was a manufactured hoax. On this, we can side with Trump's complaints against Russiagate, I think. So when you say that there's a civil war in the federal government, keep in mind who started this civil war. It was the establishment that took the first shots. And they're trying to do this all throughout Europe as well. I mean, sometimes they're just outright overturning elections, as in the case of Romania. In France, they managed to do to Le Pen what they hoped they were going to be able to do with the Trump impeachments. They get her on a technicality, and now she's barred from running. But none of these moves have done anything to stabilize, to bring back stability for them. None of them have helped improve the appeal of the status quo of all these hated parties. So in each of these countries, in Germany, the AfD is the most popular party now. The rally in France is still leading the polls. Farage, Reform UK, is still leading. In each of these parties, this is the one force that is tapping systematically into that discontent. I would say also that the troubles facing the European ruling class have really only started. I mean, you're seeing like a sense of panic in the European ruling class in particular, but the debt level of the OECD countries has skyrocketed. The average debt to GDP is around 111%. Interest payments in France are the single biggest expense in the French budget. Bayrou, I hope comrades are watching what's happening in France. This Prime Minister, Bayrou, the president, is about to fall, is scheduled to fall on Monday. And the language coming out of the French labor movement is incredibly militant. I mean, they're basically quoting Lenin, saying the ruling class can't rule like before, and the working class can't tolerate their conditions like they did before. And this is an era of class war. Let's occupy the factories. This is not us saying this. This is the Unité CGT. This is like the left wing but this is a massive force. But these are the conditions, this is the mood among the French working class. French ministers have said openly, 2 different French finance ministers have said that France is going to need an IMF bailout. You have high-profile UK economists saying the same thing about Britain, about the British debt. The IMF has $1 trillion in lending capacity. Just to put it into perspective, British debt is 3.8 trillion. French debt is 3.1 trillion. When they bailed out Greece 10 years ago, that was $37 billion. I mean, we're talking about a level of insolvency that is totally different. So to have Western European countries, OECD countries, moving into a Sri Lanka-style predicament where they cannot pay their bills, but they're also not going to be able to continue governing and operating because to move forward, I mean, they cannot make a right step. The Economist published an article last week, Fear the Deficit Populism Doom Loop. This is how they're kind of trying to get sympathy from the reader. Listen, you're a finance minister. Put yourself... I had to take a government class in high school, and they gave us like pretty much this exact scenario. You're a finance minister after a decade of meager economic growth, shocks from a financial crisis, a pandemic, and sky-high energy prices. Public debt is worth more than your country's GDP. Interest rates are at their highest in years, and merely servicing outstanding debt is taking up an ever greater share of tax revenue. Inflation is stubborn. America is satisfying much of the world's appetite for government bonds, meaning your debt must pay more to attract investors. You lie awake, worrying about how to make the numbers add up. Your fellow ministers, meanwhile, fret for their careers. Populist parties are on the rampage. The economic context calls for fiscal consolidation. The political one warns against austerity. What do you do? Give me a 50-word answer. But the article ends by pointing out that the populists are the ones, they're talking about the deficit populism doom loop. They're saying, we found this curious correlation between an increase in austerity and the rising appeal of populism. But that doesn't mean that the populists are going to have it easy either. They say the populist bind is a tight one. This is how the article ends. Pity the finance minister hoping to keep debt burdens under control and the hard right at bay. At least during his sleepless nights, he can console himself that when he is booted from office, his populist successor will face many of the same constraints. See how they like it. And that is true. I mean, once you have this force in the wings that can benefit, and they're skillfully doing everything they can to use this, all of this discontent and all this incompetent bungling from the establishment parties, everything the establishment does to try and hold them off is only helping them. But once you have these forces start to get into the control room in country after country, they're going to completely expose themselves because they have no solutions for any of this. Europe's underlying predicament is it is no longer in the U.S. interest to underwrite Europe. It's no longer a strategic priority for the U.S. That's the basic reality that's changed from the post-war era to the present. The U.S. needs to pivot away. And the ruling class is like coming to terms with this, and it's like they can't really accept it. I mean, it seems like they're going crazy. Sometimes it looks like an irrational denial of this new reality. If you look at the way that they've treated the war in Ukraine, they're talking about, this war-type hysteria about Russia's about to invade Denmark, and Russia's about to invade Sweden, and Russia's plotting to march into Berlin. And this is the future. The Russians are coming for us. And Putin will never be stopped until we all unite against him. This is the way that they're talking. But at the World Congress, this point was made. This propaganda may be insane, and it's true. It's a lie. They're lying to the working class of Europe, saying Putin is coming for you. Putin's coming for all of us. Putin's going to invade Europe. But the European ruling class does have its reasons to fear Russia. Their imperialist interests really are under threat. In Central Europe and Eastern Europe, there's a question of which pole will have a greater gravitational pull on an entire section. I mean, Europe will be fragmented because it'll make sense for a lot of these smaller countries in the middle of Europe to say, look, we have to trade more with the most stable power here. But it's more than that. It's also in the Baltic. This is the Baltic after the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is like Lithuania, Ethiopia, Estonia, some far-flung little countries After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Swedish banks went in and dominated those areas. This became part of they basically carved up all the former spheres of influence of the Soviet Union. They now risk losing that again. And then you have the Arctic. That's a big, in the Arctic, there are some predictions that the Arctic is going to be ice-free somewhere in between 2050 or within the next 10 years by some predictions, which is incredible. And never mind the catastrophic rise in sea levels and what that's going to mean. This is opening up markets. Rare earths are going to be available. You're going to have fishing areas, oil and gas deposits. But above all, it's the shipping lanes. The maritime route that connects Europe to Asia right now goes through the Suez Canal. Once it's open in the Arctic, it's going to cut that down by 50%. And so all of European countries are looking at this, and the Arctic has for a long time been something that they've been interested in. Now, Russia dominates the Arctic. This is completely a sphere of influence of Russia. More than half of Arctic territory is Russian. More than half of the Arctic population is Russian. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Russia was on its knees, all of these other small Arctic states said, let's have a second look at the Arctic, and they formed the Arctic Council. Now, this is any country that has any part of its territory above the Arctic line. Canada, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the United States, and Russia was a part of this. Since then, they've opened it up. If anyone else wants to join Club Arctic, we're going to have, there's observer country status, and you can get in on this. So Germany joins, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Poland, Singapore, China joins, India, South Korea, Spain, Japan, Switzerland, the UK. Everyone wants to join Club Arctic. Now, when the Russia-Ukraine war started in 2022, they decided we're going to kick Russia out of the Arctic Council. They essentially tried to, the Arctic states said, we're going to boycott all future meetings of this, except we're going to form a new council. It's not going to include Russia. And so while they're playing all these games, I mean, Russia has complete military dominance in the Arctic. It's been opening up dozens of Soviet-era military bases. It dominates the shipping lanes. It's natural gas. There's a lot of, the pipelines start in the Arctic. And so, you know, the small European groups are kind of looking to band together and try and hold the Russians at bay. This recent NATO meeting that Trump convinced the Europeans that the US is going to close the taps. We're not going to keep arming Ukraine directly. But if you want to arm Ukraine, you can buy weapons from the US and you can send them to Ukraine. This is what the Europeans were forced to accept. And that's begun now. In the last week, you had the first installment of these weapons purchases. Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway scraped together $825 million and purchased 3,500 extended range cruise missiles to give to Ukraine. It's not going to make any difference in the case of the Ukraine war, but now you have these small countries that are basically footing this bill, sending these money and resources into a black hole at the hopes of holding the Russians, keeping them back and keeping the war going above all. You know, they want to keep the US involved. But when you look at it from this perspective, here's the other thing that, look, the French imperialists have lost their connection to the African former colonies, which they dominated up until now. Since 2022, the French have been kicked out. They had troops in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Chad, Senegal, and Ivory Coast. They've been kicked out of all of those countries, and the Russians have come in. Russians are arming those countries. They're trading with them. They're giving them wheat. Russians are getting control of mines in those countries. So Russia is, to this extent, you can see, this is how the European imperialists look at Russia as an existential threat. It's a threat to their imperialist interests, not a threat to the working class of Europe. It's a threat to all of these extra sources, these streams of income in imperialist markets that are now becoming spheres of influence of the other rival bloc. So it makes more sense why Macron, follows Zelensky around like this behind his every step, and why they're having, Macron is the big champion of holding Zelensky's arm in the air. We're going to be here for you. And the Europeans, they're doubling down always. They had this coalition, this meeting of the willing, the coalition of the willing on Saturday, while the Shanghai Cooperation Organization was meeting. We're going to have our own international meeting. We're going to have 30 countries together, all these little tiny European countries, I think what was the statement that they came up with this plan, a reassurance force. That's the new, and it made me picture like they're at the end. Could we all form a line, and then Zelensky would walk down the line. Everyone gives them a pat on the back and gives us some reassuring comments. That's the reassurance force. That's all that Europe has to offer Ukraine. They have no weapon. I mean, the whole point of the Ukraine war as a war of attrition is that it has exposed this reality that one side has an industrial military base that's powerful, that's able to sustain itself and expand, and has expanded in the course of the war. And the other side is basically broke, has very limited reserves, has one force that is able to supply arms, and that's the United States. Pull the US out, which is what Trump is doing, and Europe has nothing left to fight with. That's the reality on the ground. They're talking about we're going to have any day now. The pending discussion is the US is going to provide a security backstop. Macron says that's one of our decisions. We're all really excited. This security backstop's going to come any day now. It's not going to come because the United States is pivoting away. I've been reading some articles also that are trying to argue that the US is making a mistake by pivoting away from Europe. One of them was from the Atlantic Council. The headline is Russia or China the greater threat to the US? This says there's a clear answer, and they argue that Russia is the greater threat because it has the most nuclear warheads of any country in the world. It has 5,500 compared to just over 5,000 that the US has. China has 600. They also make the point, and these are true, that Russia has real combat experience. Russia has had troops on the ground. They've been fighting global conflicts. China hasn't had a ground war in many decades, not a serious one. But beyond this, the main argument they're making is that Europe should still matter to the US economically. The trade, the volume of trade between the US and the EU, the largest bilateral trade relationship in the world, more than 40% of global GDP. The US Chamber of Commerce has called it, said there's no two other regions in the world that are as deeply integrated as the US and Europe. All of that is true, but it kind of misses the point because Trump is not trying to cut off the US from Europe. What Trump is trying to do is demote Europe from the status of a partner to the status of a subordinate vassal that can be squeezed, that can be made to suffer the pain, that can be a pain sponge for the economic problems that are facing the West. He's taking his allies saying, you're going to go first, into the chaos. You have, this debt problem is really serious. You're going to suffer it first. Oh, you have to implement austerity. Europe's going to do it first. That's what Trump is doing. That's what he's trying to do to all of the former allies of the US. There was another piece that was in The Atlantic by Nick Clegg. This is the former UK Deputy Prime Minister in the 2010s. And he wrote this essay about the wonders of transatlanticism, which read like a heartbroken letter, like saying, let's not break up. We can work out our differences, but it's going to be too painful if we actually break up. And he says, he gives kind of his credentials. I used to work as an EU trade negotiator for the European Parliament. I was part of an effort working with various US administrations to build a rules-based global trading system. As Britain's Deputy Prime Minister, I worked with the Obama administration on an array of shared endeavors, including counter-terrorist operations and commercial agreements. It's like, can we just go back to the time when we were invading Iraq together and we were getting along? Everything was, it was a happier time. He says, in short, a world in which Europe and America don't walk tall and in tandem with each other, even when they disagree, is hard for me to contemplate. An interesting point that he brings up is that at this time, just 15 years ago, the GDPs of Europe and the United States were basically 1-to-1. Now, the US is 1.5 times larger. He makes the point that what's pulling this relationship apart, ironically, is the demonstrable nature of America's supremacy over Europe. Now, what's the basis of this supremacy? He says an open trading system built on the undisputed role of the dollar as the global reserve currency. That's getting shaky now. Investors are not so confident in the stability of the US dominating the financial currency system. The deployment of overwhelming defense and security capabilities, that plug is being pulled. The gravitational pull of a world-leading university system. The university system isn't doing so great right now. Trump is attacking it, freezing its funds, but also people are coming out with degrees and huge debt and nothing to do with it. I mean, the US universities are in decline. Economic prowess built on American domination of both international finance and technology. The US on all of these benchmarks has comprehensively pulled ahead of Europe. That may be true from Europe's perspective, but the US is on the retreat from all of these things in terms of, pillars of its own power. The last point, he says, the frictions and disagreements between Europe and America have always been there, but the divisions seem starker now. They're increasingly framed in zero-sum terms. And when I read that, I've been thinking, I've been seeing this phrase about zero-sum. There was the Financial Times had this response, Zoran Mamdani is wrong. Billionaires should exist. He said, of course, billionaires should exist. The Democratic Socialist candidate to be mayor of New York seems to think that the economy is a zero-sum game, where if you do better, it must mean that I do worse. This is profoundly mistaken. While amassing their fortunes, billionaires make the rest of us richer, not poorer. But this zero-sum, there was another thing in The Economist, this is the headline, to understand America today, study the zero-sum mindset. Let me just read this at the beginning of it. It says, look at the news or social media these days, and you might see a pattern. Stories are about groups in conflict, competing for limited resources, with the gains for some framed as losses for others. More and more, debates are shaped by a mindset that sees the world as a fixed pie, where one group's gain is another's loss. It goes on to say, we need to look at where this mentality comes from. It doesn't just come from nowhere. The article continues, people who have done better than their parents and experience upward mobility are less likely to think in zero-sum terms. This also explains why younger generations in America are more zero-sum. They've grown up during times of slower economic growth and lower mobility. other rich countries exhibit a similar generational pattern. This is the OECD. It calls it, at the end of it, the article saying, politicians need to look at this. We should have some more win-win policies, It's funny that the other economist article is saying, like, put yourself in the position of a finance minister. There's nothing you can do. And this one's saying, maybe we should just do more win-win, so everyone can do better. But to me, this kind of gets to the heart of what we're saying with our perspectives, actually. I mean, the world is a fixed pie. Globalization is over. And that's what that means. You don't have the expansion of markets anymore. And all of these new technologies, the new industries that are arising, that's competition for a very small number of powers in the world. But when the volume of trade was expanding in the post-war, you had new industries, new markets, new territories to incorporate into the global market, new populations that were coming into after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Restoration of capitalism in China. There was that gave it expanse. And when you have expansion, that's when that mechanism of capitalism basically creates an environment. It's like the capitalist will say, tomorrow the market's going to be bigger than it is today. So it makes sense to invest in the future. That's no longer the horizon that they see. So they're not going to invest. They have nothing to kind of look forward to, which is why they're pouring it all into stock buybacks, and they're basically just parasitically just absorbing that in their own bank accounts. The size of the investment that you need for the cutting edge industries, if you look at the past, steam power was very important at one time for international balance of power. Railroads, steel, coal, right? In the 20th century was oil, the auto industry, and then who has the oil becomes the big question. Now the global scramble is for AI. You need massive computing power to do that. You need like data centers, and you need microchips, superconductors. On top of this, you have renewable energies and rare earths. These are basically, this is the imperialist scramble of our time. But the amount of investment that you need, the amount of capital to even participate in the game is so great that the Europeans can't afford it. Europe is screwed because it's 27 little ruling classes, each with their own interests. They don't have one big bank that has all of their capital united, or one centralized power that can, marshal that capital towards one purpose and make strategic decisions. What you need right now, these markets and these industries call for maximum capital, maximum concentration, and maximum centralization, which is what China and Russia have. China in particular, both have the birthmarks of former worker states. Consider that the relationship between the state in China and the ruling class is a very unique one. Most of the time, the bourgeoisie creates its state, and then it has control over it. The bourgeoisie, the Chinese capitalists, didn't overthrow the state to restore capitalism. The Chinese bureaucracy allowed the bourgeoisie to come out onto the scene by its own mercy and within strict limits. And they have, it's state capitalism is what you have in China. And the U.S. doesn't have this advantage that its rivals has. Its rivals basically have a secret weapon in the form of a very heavy-handed state that the U.S. doesn't have in its toolbox. And this is why there's huge pressure on Trump to try and create a heavier-handed state than what you've had in previous administrations. This golden share of U.S. Steel gives the U.S. administration the power to outvote all other shareholders on basically any decision-making with U.S. Steel, what they're going to do with the plants, the workers' salaries even. In July, the Defense Department bought the largest stake in MP Materials, a rare earth mining company, for $400 million in taxpayer money. That's basically like a 15% nationalization of that company. NVIDIA and Advanced Micro Devices, AMD, they were barred from selling chips to China until they offered to give Trump a 15% cut of the revenue that they made from those sales. Trump has taken a 10% share of Intel. That's worth $11 billion. People are calling that the biggest state intervention since the 2008 bailout. But that's part of a grant that the CHIPS Act under Biden had provided to Intel, which has been turned from just a grant into like actual shares that are now purchased by the US government. At this time that basically Intel is getting partly bailed out by the government, its stock price is still 60% lower than what it was 25 years ago. Intel comes from the early 2000s. This was a computer chip maker from a world where you still had floppy disks, and it hasn't been competitive in the smartphone world or in these, but it's like a grandpa company and it needs crutches now, and that's what this represents. But they're laying off 25,000 employees at this time when they're getting this big bailout. And then you have other interventions like Trump, truth social posts against, telling Walmart, eat the tariffs, threatening Apple that he's going to tariff Apple if they don't move operations over from India back to the U.S. So this is one of the things that conservative columnists are saying. Well, Mamdani says he wants to control the means of production, but Trump is saying he wants to be the major stakeholder in the means of production. So we're not comfortable with this. And Trump is doing socialism. The Daily also did an episode about Trump is changing American capitalism. And they talk about how Trump has made statements saying, this is just the beginning. We're just getting warmed up. We want to do a lot more of this. We want to move in this direction. People are like, what does this mean for American capitalism? But you can see why there's a pressure to do this in terms of these are the key industries that he's trying to compete with on the global stage against powers that have a huge amount of centralization and state power. Just to put this into perspective, in World War II, the US carried out real nationalizations of manufacturing, coal mines, railroads, oil refineries, telecommunications. These were some industries were taken over entirely. Even retail chains, Montgomery Ward's, department stores. All of this was taken. 3,000 different coal mines were nationalized during World War II. All arms manufacturing, including Smith & Wesson, was taken over. This is part of what allowed the US to build up its productive capacity to fight the war and to come out with that productive capacity at the disposal of the American capitalist class. In a sense, they did in World War II what the Chinese state has been doing for the last 20 years. Massive state investment is what created that big pool to build its productive capacity. Now, if the U.S. were to do this again, it would basically be taking a step not toward socialism, but toward state capitalism. But it can't be done. It certainly can't be done so easily in the U.S. as it's being done in China. For one, there's elections to worry about. You can't have a long-term. It's hard. You can hardly have a five-year plan if you don't know what's going to happen at the next election. She's been in power since 2012. Putin's been in since 1999, and so you have this. This is another thing. Like bourgeois democracy isn't helping in this competition. Just to say that also. The AI, a big part of investment isn't just like creating machines. It's also the research and the R&D that they're doing. But in 2000, the U.S. was spending 30 times more than China on R&D. Now it's about 1-to-1, but by purchasing power, China is spending double what the U.S. is doing. In terms of AI being one of these big races, 15 years ago, the US had more than double the AI patents that China had. Now China has 70% and the US has 14%. This is a graphic that I found that really puts it into perspective. Who's winning the AI patent race? So China is completely dominating. I mean, at least in terms of the big development. The US is pouring a lot of money into it, but that doesn't really tell you all that much. The MIT came out with a report that found that 95% of the companies that are generating AI technology, the generative pilots, they're failing. Only 5% are turning a profit. So you can have billions of dollars being poured by venture capitalists into these businesses as a gamble, hoping they're going to strike it rich. But it doesn't actually tell you that this is going to help the U.S. to lead. After all, obviously, what China did with DeepSeek was basically achieve the same thing that ChatGPT can do with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the computing power, fraction of the chips. The power of the chips. Sam Altman of OpenAI has said that he thinks this is a bubble now, and there's a lot of headlines about this in big tech. The big tech stocks are mostly the top 10 stocks of the stock market. That's 40% of the stock market in the U.S. There's huge speculation taking place, and the question of how this is going to affect the broader economy and the broader working class, how many jobs this could eliminate is another big question that's going to be a major thing. This is one of the things that's pulling MAGA coalition apart, because you have the working class populist base. Obviously, it doesn't align with the Silicon MAGA tech bros who are championing crypto and saying we want AI deregulation. They're worried about the job losses. And it's not just like the music of the future. these job losses are already happening. I mean, you have to the extent that you've had mass layoffs, it's been in tech. And to the extent that you have huge unemployment, it's for recent college grads, particularly computer science. I mean, that's where you have this slowdown. And think about, for the first time, this is one of the stats that Comrades were discussing this week, recent college graduates now have a higher unemployment rate than the general population. Recent college grads, those that spent years and tens of thousands of dollars to educate themselves and follow the rules with the hopes of doing something productive, society has no need for them and can't find a place for them. And they have they're the most desperate layer of society now. They're the ones that can't find a place to get plugged in with the market. What does that tell you about American capitalism? Can't find a role for them. I mean, this is, as you know, large numbers of young, educated workers with no future and no prospects is an explosive ingredient. The Wall Street Journal said a record low 25% of people say they think they have a good chance of improving their standard of living. That's a record low since surveys started in 1987. More than 3/4 say they lack confidence that the next generation is going to live better. 70% of people say they believe the American dream, that if you work hard, you'll get ahead, no longer holds true or never did. That's the highest level in nearly 50 years of surveys. I think that's probably unprecedented. I mean, this is the result of all of these processes that we're talking about. I think, comrades can come in about Indonesia, but one of the flammable ingredients in Indonesia was precisely having a large number of young, educated youth workers with no prospects and nothing to do. The comrades on the ground could see this coming. They were describing this at the World Congress, that you could see various symptoms, like job openings would attract thousands of people who would line up around the blocks. And they would have, some of these jobs that would attract huge numbers were like street sweeper. And people were quoted in the line saying, well, yeah, I'd rather be a street sweeper than to live on the street. This is the level of desperation that young people, they were saying that the most popular book right now, the bestseller among young people, is a fiction book inspired by the 1998 revolution. This was all in early August when we were in Italy. I mean, they could see very clearly what was about to happen. In February, you had Dark Indonesia. This was a short-lived movement, mostly of young people also. It wasn't quite on the scale that we're seeing now, but the new president, Prabowo, was elected in November last year with a landslide victory and a supermajority in the parliament. He was talking about gold in Indonesia. We're going to develop Indonesia, and we're going to become one of the strong powers in the world. And then he starts in with harsh austerity, cuts to every single ministry. Meanwhile, what really kicked it off a few weeks ago, in the middle of last month, was when ministers gave themselves a $3,000 raise at a time when most workers are earning less than $300 a month. And that's what set off the social explosion. And then when you had this 21-year-old delivery driver, Afan Kurniawan, killed, being rammed by a tactical vehicle of the police, that's what really transformed the protest into a nationwide insurrection. I mean, there's no other word for what's happening right now. They're calling for the dissolution of parliament. Members of parliament are having their mansions raided and looted, stormed by protesters. One of these members of parliament that called the protesters, it's like they put do you have anything to say about the protesters that are calling for the dissolution of parliament? And he says, yeah, I would say that they are the stupidest people on earth. And then he finds that his home is stormed by thousands of people who are live streaming themselves, taking a $600,000 watch out of his bedroom. I mean, this has happened to the finance minister of the country and to various other members of the state. Not only that, their prime target, they've burnt down the parliamentary buildings throughout the region. Indonesia is actually it's a pretty huge spread out country. It's got a massive population, 284 million. It's the fourth largest country in the world by population, right after the United States. There's regional parliamentary buildings. 37 of them have been stormed, have been burnt or damaged to some extent. That's as of a week ago. By now, maybe they've hit the 40. The protesters have burnt down not one police station, not 50, but hundreds of police stations. They've burnt them down across the country. I mean, what this shows you is that a revolution is unfolding. It doesn't have a leadership, but their slogan is dissolve parliament. Our small forces are putting forward a program calling for a general strike, bring the revolution into the factories, organize this as a force that has, self-organization of the working class-independent organization, workers' defense guards. And basically the comrades, what they're putting forward is the only way forward. The only way that this revolution could succeed is being communicated by our very limited forces. But of course, we don't have the comrades we don't have the numbers required to reach the masses with that message. I think the same thing, what's around the corner for France, these massive social explosions. What's needed, you could see that we're moving into a situation where people would be completely open to a revolutionary program. Every move that they're making is showing they want a class war, and they want that class war to escalate. The anger isn't finding a channel, it's not finding a leadership that can show where it would move forward. But I think in the long run, the point of all of these perspectives is that these scenes are the logical outcome of the entire situation. The ruling class has no way to avoid this same fate. They can't avoid what's happening in Indonesia, happening at a certain point in the OECD countries, happening at a certain point in every country on earth, because their system, the exhaustion of its system, that's something that they have no control over. They cannot reverse that. And that's the meaning of the crisis of capitalism. I think if we can help the comrades understand history is locked into this trajectory. It's a matter of time before we're faced with a revolutionary explosion on the order of Indonesia today. And it's all a question of having our forces prepared to be able to intervene in it, to play our role in history.